ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Eric Sanderson.
Good morning, everybody. So I want to talk to you very briefly about the city that wants to be a forest. So I'm an ecologist. I'm a landscape and ecosystem ecologist, and I work for a wildlife conservation organization. And I want to welcome you to the ecoregions of the United States. So when we think about the United States, we often think about the states. We think about New York State or New Jersey or California or Kansas. But this map actually shows the way nature thinks about the lower 48 United States, and there's Alaska and Hawaii, as ecoregions. And if you look, you can see we're in 221 up there, which is in the light green. You think you're in New York City and New York State, but in fact you're in the Central Appalachian Broadleaf Forest, Coniferous Forest Meadow Province of the country. And someday we might have a Congress that's organized this way. But right now, if you want to see its constituency, you have to go to a vacant lot. And if you leave a vacant lot in New York City, you'll see this community reassert itself. The problem is it's hard, particularly in a place as developed as Manhattan, to see that community. But the idea and the processes that lead to that community are still here. And one way we can start to realize them is just to remember where we've come from, to remember that this island that we call Manhattan was once an island in the very same place that was called Mannahatta. I don't know if we can turn down these lights that are right on the screen. That would be terrific. A long, narrow, wooded island of 55 different ecological communities with more than 1,000 species living here, including people. And you can see some smoke rising from the Lenape community, from the Algonquin community near the Collect Pond down in lower Manhattan. And this was a brief 400 years ago that Manhattan looked like this. It wouldn't have been a surprise to the early European settlers who came here to talk to them about the forests of Manhattan. This is a quote from Johan de Laet in 1633, a Dutch settler who said that our countrymen who first explored this river and those who subsequently made frequent journeys here described the wonderful size of the trees. Wild grapevines are abundant and walnut trees. There's a great variety of herbaceous plants, some of which bear splendid flowers, and others considered valuable for their medicinal properties here in New York. We can see these communities. You know, there isn't one habitat. Just like there isn't one habitat today, there isn't the habitat. There were many different habitats that were on Manhattan. Hemlock northern hardwood forest, or the ponds, the kettle ponds, the coastal plain pond. If you've been down in Foley Square 400 years ago, you would have seen an ecosystem like this. Coastal Appalachian oak pine forests on the ridge tops and on the slopes. Red maple swamps. This is what Times Square might have looked like if you'd been an ecologist and walked around 400 years ago on Manhattan. Oak tulip tree forest. This is a picture not from Central Park, but another one of the forever wild managed areas on Manhattan up in Inwood Hill Park. And this forest isn't so different than we would have seen 400 years ago, except that 400 years ago there would have been more American chestnut. American chestnut would have been half the basal area of the forest. There would have been trees that would have required 5 people to hug. You'd have to hold hands to get your hands all the way around them. And there would have been less understory probably than what we see here, because Native Americans were lighting fires as a way of facilitating their movements across the island. There were grasslands. Harlem, just to the north of here, was originally a grassland. Again, probably maintained by human interventions, by people managing the land by setting fires to make it a great place to hunt for deer and for birds. So it's really important to remember when we talk about a place like Manhattan that it's been continuously occupied for at least 8,000 years. The oldest archaeological sediments in New York City go back to 8,000 years ago when the Hudson River ran another 100 miles out to sea. And Manhattan was just a set of hills on top of a fjord that was just to the side that had a little stream in the bottom of it that was called the Hudson River. The people that were here when the Europeans first arrived were the Lenape people, sometimes called the Delaware. They'd been living here for at least 1,000 years before then, and had a life where they grew their own crops and hunted and fished and took advantage of the shellfish in the harbor. So lived here and changed the landscapes to make it fit for them. You know, they were species just like any other in the landscape, trying to survive, trying to make their way. They grew these crops that had been traded up out of up from Mexico, corn, beans, and squash. Actually lovely, very productive symbiosis. Some modeling we've done has shown that these kind of fields can be as productive as Illinois or Iowa in terms of its productivity, except that you can't harvest the corn with a tractor. You have to do it with your hands. So people were living here, and they were influencing the landscape. They were making campsites and active fields, and after 20 or 25 years, they would abandon those fields, and they'd become old fields, and those old fields would eventually become shrublands over maybe a 100-year cycle, and those shrublands would eventually become forest again. But not just one kind of forest. They become tulip tree forests, and oak hickory forest, and oak pine forests. There would have been beaches nearby, and salt marshes, and like I said, 55 different ecological communities. And these were the neighborhoods that people recognized 400 years ago. These would have been as distinct to them as the Upper East Side or Tribeca or Central Park is to us. You could have picked up a Lenape person and dropped them in an oak hickory forest, and they could have told you what you could eat there and what kind of animals you would observe there and what their neighbors would be doing. In the same way that you can pick up a Manhattanite today and drop them in another neighborhood, and they would take the blindfold off and look around and see the structures and see the people walking down the street and know exactly where they are. So people were part of a landscape that other species lived in. So chicken mushrooms, 600 different species of plants, we think, maybe as many as 800, 75 different species of fish, anadromous fishes, marine fishes, freshwater fishes. There were birds, 350 bird species, most of which can still be seen in Central Park today, remarkably, particularly during the migrations. This bird you can't see. This is the heath hen, which unfortunately was a grassland specialist that went extinct when the grasslands, like the Harlan Plains, were all disappeared. Although they hung out all the way until 1929. We have all the birds except for the heath hen and the passenger pigeon and maybe the Eskimo curlew, which was a shorebird. We had beavers, and I always like to mention beavers in this kind of context because beavers have a lot of influence on the landscape. They're what we call a landscape species. And what beavers do is they build dams, as you know, and then they build lodges in those dams, and they do that for entirely their own reasons. They do it because they want to make a moat around the place they live so wolves and other animals can't get at them. And they want to make a water conduit for their transportation so they can move logs over to their lodges so they can eat them in safety. They want to bring their dinner home to them. And of course those dams, they create habitat, they create ponds in the forest, but they also flood trees and those trees die. Of course some of those trees that get flooded and that die then get, woodpeckers make holes in them, and those tree cavities become nesting habitat for wood ducks, you know, the brilliant wood ducks that, you know, on the East Coast we're so lucky to have. The people would travel all around the world to see such a brightly covered duck. And wood ducks are on decline, and they're on decline because a tree with a cavity in it over a pond of water, it's a very uncommon habitat anymore because we don't let beavers do what they do. So beavers structured the landscape and created habitat and destroyed habitat for other species. And I can give you, you're probably already thinking, what's an example of another species that does that? So wolves just were on for the ride. There were wolves on Manhattan and black bears and river otters, whales and porpoises in the harbor, seals. If the United States had been settled from the west coast to the east instead of the other way around, by the time we got to the east coast, we might have said, well, maybe we should set aside some land for nature, and we might have made Manhattan the national park. And people would come all over around the world to see the great wildlife of Mannahatta National Park. It would have been the best national park on the East Coast. But they come for other reasons now. As part of the work to reconstruct what was here 400 years ago, we had to understand all the habitat relationships of all the species that were here. And that kind of information you can display as a network. And that network we call a Muir web, after John Muir. And what I like to show about this is that every point on this complicated diagram is a different plant or animal or soil type or a stream type, and every gray line is a habitat connecting that piece to something else. And one of those dots, it's one of the ones over here on the side over here, is human beings. And everything about human beings, our network of life, which is equally vast and amazing, is inside that node. Does that make sense to you? That I think so much of our relationship to nature is because we're so fascinated by our node, by our network, by our arts and our culture and our science and our social network and Facebook and who we know at work and all these things that we forget about this much larger network that we're part of and that we influence and influences us. So it seems kind of ironic that Henry Hudson didn't care at all about New York, right? He was trying to find his way to China because he wanted to trade in China and make a lot of money. And because he was so focused on that goal, those kind of interactions, he missed the mirror web of interactions that was right in front of him on Manahatta, something that in fact we're missing entirely in the world today. We don't have a place like Manahatta that has all of its species and all of them at abundance and interacting in a strong way the way Manhattan once had. That's what the whole conservation movement about is, trying to restore some semblance of those kinds of connections that used to we have on the world. But of course, this landscape changed. This is the population curve, that red line from 1790. This is the human population till today. Did you know that the Manhattan population maxed out in 1910 at 2.2 million people? There's about 1.6 million people living in Manhattan today. So we're actually down from our historical peak. The last 20 years or so have seen a slight uptick, but we're nowhere close to where we once were in terms of number of people. Those are the people that Olmsted was eventually going to serve by creating a park for them to come and to visit. Nobody knows what this curve should be. In New York, we often assume it just has been escalating from the time of the Lenape forever, and that it's just going to continue going up and up and up. But in fact, most biological populations don't work like that. There are limits eventually, and we find other ways to live. You can see actually the transition from the streetcars to the automobile and the reduction, and that led to the 1970s and the decline of Central Park. And you can see the improvements of the city as we've come to manage the density-dependent effects of our city. Of course, needless to say, this has a consequence for trees. George Washington noticed it in 1781, saying that the island of Manhattan is totally stripped of its trees, wood of every kind, but low bushes appear in places that were forest, just before the Revolution started. Olmsted noticed this. Olmsted wrote in 1872, "The time will come when New York will be built up, when all the grading and filling will be done, when the picturesquely varied rocky formations of the island will have been converted into formations for rows of monotonous straight streets and piles of erect buildings. There will be no suggestion left of its present varied surface, with the single exception of a few acres contained in the park." And that vision has come to pass. Here's a picture of the very last tree on Fifth Avenue from 1913. Missing its friends, I'm sure. So we can talk about how Manahatta worked as a way of understanding how ecology works, but recognizing that we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world that looks something more like this, in exactly the same place. But history doesn't end today either. History continues marching forward. And so, the purpose of my work in Manahatta is not to wipe off half of New York City and create what my son likes to refer to as the half park. But in fact, to build ideas of how ecosystems work and how resilience works into our idea of living in the city today. And this isn't just my idea. In fact, I think it's the most important idea about how we're reinventing the notion of New York City and cities all over the world as we speak. If you talk to young people about what it means in New York City, they're going to talk to you about green roofs and urban farms and vacant lots and taking walks in the woods. So what are our dreams today? The city that we live in is the accumulated dreams of the past. What are we dreaming of now? Where do we want to go to next? What will we keep and what will we give? What do we value? What will we say to the skeptical and to the intrepid and to the imaginative about the world that we're giving them by the decisions we make right now? So to help us answer some of those questions and to get some perspectives, which I'm actually very pleased. I can't tell you how happy it is to me that a meeting that's about Central Park on Manhattan has invited 2 speakers from the outer boroughs to give them advice and someone from the West Coast, which is a wonderful combination. That's a mark of humility, which I think will be very important in our discussions today. So without any more ado, the speakers are going to follow in this order. Todd Forrest from the New York Botanical Garden will speak. And then we'll have Michael Ballin from the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. And then finally, Christian Zimmerman will come up from the Prospect Park Alliance.